Ever heard of Army camels? So in 1855, the US Army decided to import camels to Texas. The wide open spaces of the West were well suited for them, so they were like, yeah, let's bring in 75 camels from the Middle East. They worked at Camp Verde, where they made supply runs to San Antonio. But a few years later, the Civil War disrupted the service when a government official decided to auction off the animal, and the new owners sent some of them to Nevada, some to California, and other ones were just sort of set free. Now at first you didn't really see them around, but in the 1880s, Arizona Territory faced a terrible menace known as the Red Ghost. What did it do? Well, it trampled one woman, whereas another story claimed the monster ate a grizzly bear. When miners spotted the Red Ghost and fired at it, a human skull fell from the creature's back. After years of terrorizing Arizona, eventually it was taken out. What was it? Just a feral camel. Now camel sightings in the West continued into the 20th century, which is so wild. Like imagine just going about your day, damn, a camel. Time to talk about a famous criminal. Billy the Kid was wanted in 1881 for shooting a sheriff in Nebraska and another man in a New Mexico saloon. Running from a $500 bounty on his head, he was eventually trapped and put on trial. And it didn't go the way he wanted. The judge found Billy guilty, saying the outlaw would hang until he was dead, dead, dead. Billy responded, "You can go to hell, hell, hell." How poetic. His date with the gallows set, Billy pulled off a daring escape. On April 28th of 1881, he asked the deputy guarding his jail cell to take him to the outhouse. Once free from the cell, the outlaw pulled off his handcuffs, took the deputy's firearm, and did away with the deputy. Knowing the sheriff would be after him, Billy hid on the roof of the courthouse. When the sheriff ran up, Billy yelled, "Look up, old boy, and see what you get," and then fired on the sheriff. His escape nearly complete, he took a horse and hit the road and got away. Well, that time. We all know how the rest of the story played out. Feuding families were a doozy and a half back in the day. The Kentucky-West Virginia borders, world-famous Hatfield and McCoy families weren't the only notorious feuding clans of the old days. In fact, the Old West had a feud that went even further than that infamous incident. After the Civil War, Texas had two families, the Suttons and the Taylors, who really didn't like each other. The feud started when Buck Taylor fired at and killed a Sutton Alley in 1866, then escalated with the deaths of Taylor and a man named Dick Chisholm. 2 years later, in a horse sale gone wrong, Taylor's remaining family members dug in their heels. They had Southern pride and were mad about the Confederacy losing decisively in the Civil War. The Suttons, meanwhile, had the backing of local Texas militia members and state police outfits that were keen on Reconstruction. The Sutton family's patriarch, William, took control of the police himself by 1869, running raids across the state to ferret out cattle rustlers sympathetic to the Taylors. Over the next 5 years, all of DeWitt County, Texas was plunged into a horrifically violent feud. Even members of other families were forced to take sides and choose. Those who didn't offer allegiance risked being killed. Then again, those who did pick a team were killed in skirmishes and senseless violence as well. By 1874, so many people had died in DeWitt County that the Texas Rangers finally rode in and worked for months to ease tensions. They were mostly unsuccessful, but by the end of 1875, the feud started to slow down. And it wasn't because of anybody's really great negotiating skills. It was just because the most aggressive and vicious participants on each side had met their end. Because of everything else I've already covered today, it should come as a surprise to nobody that homicide rates in the Wild West were extremely high, rivaled only by the violence of the American South during the Civil War and Reconstruction. An adult living in Dodge City, Kansas from 1876 to 1885 stood a 1 in 61 chance of not surviving. If you lived in San Francisco, you had a 1 in 203 chance of a similarly rough end, and if you lived in other counties in California, 1 in 72. Oregon? 1 in 208. Still not great, but not awful.
The word comes from the French salon, and it originally had the same meaning, living room, as later on saloon meant hall, especially one on a boat or a train. In 1800s America, it came to meaning public house or bar. Saloons in its establishment originated as a liquor house, as the first saloon was established at Brown's Hole, Wyoming in 1822 to serve fur trappers. By 1880, the growth of saloons was in full swing. In Leavenworth, Kansas, there was about 150 saloons and 4 wholesale liquor houses. Some saloons in the Old West were little more than casino, brothels, and illegal substance dens, as in the saloons of the Wild West. Drinking was certainly a very popular activity, but there was more to it than just alcohol. Saloons often served foods such as a simple meal or snacks to accompany the drinks, as some saloons also hosted entertainment such as live music, dancing, gambling, and even theatrical performances. But the food and drinks weren't always sanitary, as it was rare for one to come across clean water, so drinking whiskey was pretty super common, as well as beer and other forms of alcohol distilled. But aside the yeehaw and crime and punishments, there was also a lot of weird things in the Wild West that aren't as jarring, like how your bed would be full of squirrels. And I'm not saying like alive squirrels, although maybe. Some of the dead squirrels that they would find would be helpful to stuff your bed to be a little softer when you stayed the night. Also, everyone smelled bad, really bad, considering there wasn't any forms of pipes or running water for miles, as water would be stagnant in the water towers and not a lot of filtration was made. The acidic and boracic acid smelling water would linger not just on you, but also on your clothes. If you were lucky, you might be able to bathe maybe once a week, as it took some time as well to warm up your bathtub, as heated water wasn't also available for the times. Other than these type of cleaning hygienics like bathing, when it came to oral care like brushing your teeth, people in the Old West used a variety of methods to clean their teeth. Some common practices include a toothbrush made out of animal hair or plant fibers, and brushing with a mixture of water and baking soda or salt. Chewing on twigs or rough cloths to rub their teeth were also very common methods, as health care like oral dental care often meant tooth extractions, as other aspects were pretty much a privilege of what we're having today that did not exist back then. As well as going to the outhouse was a more common thing than going to one in the saloon, as it would have probably stunk up the establishment and prevented customers from arriving. But that still didn't prevent people to do what the French did, which is to pee in a corner. So in the Old West, people would use a variety of materials for toilet paper, including leaves, corn cobs, newspapers, and even old catalog pages. Soft, commercial-produced toilet paper, as we are very privileged to know today, didn't become very widely available until the late 19th century. And since they didn't have plumbing, as these outhouses were so common and gross, they stunk as they attracted many types of wildlife to slither their way in with you. They had bugs like black widows, and if you're extra unlucky, maybe even poisonous snakes. Also, because of the trades of goods of many were tobacco, spittoons were located everywhere. In almost every saloon, if not, you'd be finding yourself slipping on someone else's spit. Due to the widespread of the chewing tobacco in the 19th century, spittoons were a common fixture in public areas, including railroad stations. Their intended purposes was collecting tobacco juice spit from a distance, so typically they were built heavy and low to the ground. So with a wide mouth or funnel top, in the United States, public health departments launched an anti-spitting campaign to stop the spread of TB as it became more and more aggressive in smaller populated areas. Tuberculosis had forced some of these states as spitting to be illegal, as it still is, and by the mid-20th century, spittoons were finally gone from most public spaces in the United States. I don't really think right now they still have spittoons, but that's gross. Even the towels used to clean the bathroom and the bars at saloons were the same towels you'd wipe your face if you had too much beer foam. People kept spitting, and so it was so outlawed that because of the respiratory disease went rampant in the regions, if you kept spitting, you'd be charged with a $500 fine. But either way, the Wild West, from the daily politics to hygienes, times do be changing and the world keeps on spinning. With gambling as super apparent in saloons as it was also useful pastime, it was also a risk if you were a cheat, and you might also have to cheat death, because you're not supposed to do that. Some, like the weapon fight at the OK Corral, were the outcome of long simmering feuds and rivalries, but most were the result of confrontation between outlaws and law enforcement. Although in movies, televisions would like to us believe otherwise, it was very rare when pew-pew fights occurred with the two standing fighters off squarely facing one another from a distance in a dusty street. They would just knock your butt out. The romanticized image of the Old West style fight was born in the dime novels of the late 19th century and perpetuated in film era to make such a point that this fiction version of what our mind's eye quickly conjures up when we hear the word weapon fight. You know what I mean. In actuality, the real fights of the Old West were actually so rarely civilized that yes, we might have heard some of these famed robber criminals like sharpshooters like Billy the Kid, Calamity Jane, Jesse James, and Annie Oakley. They wouldn't really wait, you know, unlike Clint Eastwood films. It was probably more rotted than it was organized, and the Wild West saloons were also known for its culture of its violence. Weapon slingers and outlaws, as I mentioned, often frequent these establishments, and disputes were often settled with a handheld weapon fight. Even saloon owners would also provide their own weapons for their patrons, and saloons itself would become a battleground during an open firefight. Saloons would also appear in every town and were your average pit stop on a long journey, and if you're a man who hasn't seen or felt the touch of a woman in a very long time and you can afford it, you might stop by to a certain saloon for a drink and quench whatever thirsty self you might be craving. Like a gentleman's club, most Wild West saloons catered almost exclusively to the white men in the frontier, although women could sometimes find work in the bars as dance hall girls or workers of the evening. But of course you have the madam of the house making sure the security of her girls are okay, but when it comes to money and gold rushes, it was pretty much more valuable than the average person's life. Respectable women didn't frequent Wild West saloons, but women who were less concerned about their reputations might find work there. Many saloon girls were widows and had no other means of support, or young girls who were seeking something more than working on their family farm. They wanted adventure, if you know what I mean. The girls were to dance with the men and get the men to buy them drinks, earning as much as $10 per week, which is pretty a lot for back then. Most saloon girls also made commissions from the drinks they sold, and whiskey sold to the customers buyers were generally marked up to 30 to 60% over its wholesale price. But like all dames who worked in these type of eras, were definitely in her bag, as her status would be noted and gossiped throughout town. One famous saloon girl was also named Fanny Porter. Fanny's family arrived in Texas when she was just 1 year old, immigrating from England. Growing up as both an immigrant and the middle of the Wild West may have inspired her to enter the sporting life, as she took up the trade as a teenager and opened up her own brothel at the age of 20 in San Antonio. In some ways though, these saloons would have been another term for these women of the night to rebrand themselves as cantina girls. However, despite themselves and the services they provide, their life expectancies were actually short. In a typical night, and I'm not just talking about in case, someone does something to them, it was because of the drinking. A woman may have to have consumed up to 30 beers a night. An average lifespan of a woman in the cantina trade was less than a decade. Like as in current times in Japan, they also have these host clubs that if you go and meet these very handsome and beautiful people, you would also be forced to drink with them. And like the cantina girls back in the Wild West, a lot of these people would have suffered a lot of liver issues, which means cantina girls still exist today, just not where we are well known of. And since I mentioned it was so dirty, they'd even bring their horses in the saloon. Like the idea of the Wild West and anyone could do anything they want. That also included bringing your horse inside of the bar to take a selfie with. Like in this photo, where the men of the saloon located in Utah took their horse to be part of the group chat profile pic, and I think my favorite part of this photo is how the bartender is also posing. But despite how gross it was back then, even part of the historical tourist attractions, there are some saloons still open and even in operation today. Saloons like the White Elephant in Fort Worth, Texas, was one of the more than 60 Wild West saloons in the city, and at the end of the 19th century, it is actually still open today for functioning, albeit in a different building. But it still holds a lot of significance, as it holds a lot of memento, part of American Western history. Back in the Wild West, people had to get creative when it came to bathroom business, as toilet paper wasn't a thing for a long time, so they had to resort into using corn cobs, torn pages from magazines, and catalogs. It wasn't until 1857 that Joseph Gaiety introduced the medicated paper, but it was sold individually, not on rolls, meaning like one sheet each one. Roll-style toilet paper didn't arrive until 1890, along with the invention of the toilet paper holder. Dust storms were a formidable and unavoidable aspect of life in the 1800s American West, and the severity of these storms, as recorded in journals and diaries, often led to eye irritation, respiratory issues, and even livestock fatalities. The pervasiveness of dust and inside homes posed continuous challenges to settlers, affecting their health and living conditions. The impact of this dust storms offers a vivid portrayal of the harsh environmental conditions faced by settlers. It emphasizes the constant battle against natural elements and the resilience required to adapt and survive in each of this challenging landscape. And if you were a cowboy, you might come into town smelling of sweat, dust, blood, or just constantly smelling the way you smell, which included smelling like a horse. The tolerance of such strong odors in public spaces reflected the period, different attitudes towards personal hygienes and social norms, and it underscores the hardship of the cowboy life, where practicalities often overruled concerns for cleanliness. Cowboys of the Wild West, after long stretches on horseback, often carried with them a distinctive and pungent horse odor. The scent often became particularly noticeable when close quarters were made, especially in local bars where cowboys gathered for refreshments, and bartenders, those poor guys, were more concerned of the profit than the smell comfort paid by little minds of their patrons stink as long as they had money. The aspect of a cowboy life offers a realistic glimpse into the less romanticized day-to-day realities of the era, where personal hygiene often took a backseat to the demands of frontier living. And so when it came to showering or bathing, the popularity of public baths reflect on the social and economic realities of the time, where communal solutions were often the only viable options for personal hygiene. It also highlights the challenges of maintaining cleanliness in an era before modern plumbing and sanitation. In the Wild West, public baths emerged as a popular solution for the majority who lacked private bathing facilities. So these communal bathhouses, often through a symbol of cleanliness and socialization, often meant sharing close quarters and even the same bath water with other people. Given the rudimentary nature of soaps at the time, these baths could paradoxically expose patrons to more dirt and bacteria from fellow bathers than they had removed. And so in the Wild West, the lack of antiseptics and unsanitary conditions made even more minor injuries potentially fatal. A simple cut or abrasion could escalate into a serious infection or disease, with settlers especially vulnerable on the trail. This reality emphasizes the constant dangers faced in daily life, where even trivial wounds pose significant health risks. The threat of diseases like cholera from from such injuries underlines the harshness of the era and the importance of caution and self-care. It also highlights the limitation of medical knowledge and practices of the time, contributing to the high mortality rates from what we know now easily are treatable conditions. While numbing the pain was a priority, the only solace came in the form of a sweet gulp of whiskey. And the lack of essential dental care resources meant oral hygiene also took a backseat to survival, and a pristine smile was a very rare gem. Toothbrushes were a luxury, and brushing one's teeth was an afterthought for many. And it gets worse, because it always does. When faced with dental issues like cavity or root canals, the remedies were far from sophisticated. Brace yourself, as the favored method was just simply getting barbers and even blacksmiths acting like makeshift dentists and just extracting your offended tooth with pliers. Women in the Wild West were often more conspicuous about personal hygienes with their male counterparts, or more than their male counterparts. Despite the challenges of privacy and limited resources, many women made effort to wash regularly, using nearby rivers and streams for basic cleanliness. This practice, alongside the advantage of being indoors, more often allowed them to maintain a higher level of personal hygiene compared to men. This gender difference in hygiene and hygienic practices showcases the early recognition of the importance of cleanliness among women, and it highlights their role in setting standards for personal care, even in a time where bathing and washing were not as so common in a practice. Cowboys and cowgirls of the Wild West era weren't just fashion trendsetters, but their choices of accessories served a dual purposes of practicality and hygiene-wise. Bandanas often provided protections against the gritty winds and scorching suns, and there's also another hidden benefit. In a time when the access to clean water and regular bathing was very limited, personal hygiene practices weren't always up to par, so the bandana, often worn around the neck or face, acted as a makeshift shield. Not only did they safeguard against dust, but they also aided in reducing the spread of germs and unpleasant odors that people so commonly came across the rugged days of the Wild West. And also, if you smelled, at least they can cover it up. In the Wild West, alcohol-fueled bar brawls were common, often escalating to very dangerous levels. The infamous firewater, a potential mix of burnt sugar, alcohol, and chewing tobacco, frequently ignited tempers over trivial matters. While many brawls resulted in minor injuries, some spiraled into deadly conflicts. This volatile environment where a simple disagreement could lead to lethal outcomes paint a vivid picture of the lawlessness and rough justice that characterized the era. The prevalence of such violent encounters in saloons highlighted the harsh realities of life in the Wild West, where disputes were often settled with fists or weapons rather than words, underscoring the perilous nature of social interactions during this time. In the 1800s, diseases like cholera, as I mentioned, was a major cause of death in the American frontier. The necessity to prioritize drinking water over uses like laundry and dishwashing exacerbated the risk of disease outbreaks. So cholera in particular claimed thousands of lives, affecting both settlers and indigenous populations. The arrival of European settlers in the Americas had a catastrophic impact on Native American populations, primarily due to the introduction of diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza. Native Americans had no prior exposure or immunity to these diseases, and they had suffered devastating losses, with some estimates indicating a reduction of up to 90% in their populations. This tragic aspect of colonial expansion underscores the lethal impact of infectious diseases in populations without natural immunity, highlighting one of the most significant and tragic consequences of the European settlement of the Americas. This grim reality of the frontier life underscores the vulnerability of populations to common diseases in the absence of modern sanitation and medical knowledge. It highlights the precariousness of life during this period, where everyday resources and practices could also mean the difference between health and widespread illness. The westward expansion of settlers under the banner of manifest destiny had a significant health implication. As they veneered into new territories, they encountered unfamiliar diseases to which they had little immunity due to poor living conditions. This exposure to new pathogens posed a significant health risk, often overwhelming their already compromised immune systems, and this aspect of frontier expansion highlights the unintended consequences of exploration and settlement on the health of the settlers, revealing the challenges and dangers they faced in unfamiliar environments. Hospitals in the 1800s, prior to the understanding of bacteria, often did much harm than good. The lack of sterilization of medical instruments and close patient quarters facilitated the rapid spread of diseases. These medical facilities, intended for healing, ironically, became hotspots for infections and diseases transmissions. The conditions in these early hospitals reflected the limited medical knowledge of the time and the challenges of providing healthcare in an era unaware of basic hygiene principles. It illustrates the paradox of places designed for healing inadvertently becoming centers of illnesses, a stark contrast to the sanitized medical environments of today. Despite the advancements of medical science, some rural doctors in the 1800s continued to use leech leeches for bloodletting, based on the outdated belief that diseases were caused by excess blood. This practice, largely abandoned by academic physicians, persisted in smaller towns, highlighting the discrepancies in medical knowledge and practices across different regions. The continued use of leech therapy in some areas served as a reminder of the slow decimation of medical knowledge and the persistence of traditional practices even in the face of emerging scientific understanding. There was a time, of course, a terrifying epidemic known as syphilis swept through a population like wildfire. In a quest for a remedy, medical professions turned into a substance that hold the key: mercury. Despite the severe side effects, patients endured a grueling routine of daily applications of mercury ointment. This reckless treatment could last for years while unleashing many horrors upon the afflicted. However, people who were convinced the treatment was worth it, I guess now we wouldn't practice it the same, but at least we got better in self-care compared to parts of history.
Kicking off the list at number 10, going the distance. First things first, how much was an IPA back in the 1800s? That's why we clicked this video, right? That's all we want to know. Some beers today cost like $13 at the bar. What's going on? Nowadays we have happy hour, drink specials, wine pairing suggestions that go along with your meal. We have affordable alternatives today at the bar. Back in the 1850s, saloons would price their drinks depending on how far away you had to travel to get there. Isn't that wild? In the Yukon, their shots of whiskey were like 50 cents a pop. That was a lot of money back in the day. If you were to ask for the same drink in a local saloon, say in Colorado, you could get numerous beverages for the same price. And as you would expect, the fancier the establishment, the more you'll spend. But either way, it's not going to be comfortable.
Number 9, manure everywhere. The 1800s were changing times, especially on the western frontier. Cities were being built, America was under reconstruction, and if you see my video on the 1800s technology, then you know how things were about to get a little wild. Except something I want to talk about today is, well, it's gonna drive moms and wives nuts across the country. How many times have you told your husband or the kids to wipe off their feet before coming into the house? Or stop wearing their shoes in the house? Right? It's the worst. I'm sorry, Mom. Okay, but imagine that, except everyone is bringing in their muddy, bloody, and manure-covered boots into the house. Horses and livestock were just a part of everyday life. That means droppings, or road apples, as they're so commonly called. The smell alone on a hot summer day could make any cowboy turn green. I think I'm going to puke, Dad.
Number 8, no stools. Okay, this one's for all the bartenders out there. I see you. I respect you. Bar seating is vital. You get your regulars coming in. Joan with the limp, she's so nice. She's always so nice every day. Always gets a grilled cheese. She's the best. Always a smile on her face. Individuals who want to grab a bite and read the paper, obviously they don't need to take up an entire table for 8, so you have spots at the bar. It's ideal. We're used to this. But back in the Western days, bar stools just weren't a thing. Bar spots it didn't exist. You couldn't sit and vent to your local barkeep about why your ex hasn't texted you back. They didn't have stools at the bar, they just had the rail at the bottom for your foot. Just that little bar rail there for the little lean right there. A nice cowboy lean. Yeah, I'll just eat fish and chips, standing up leaning. Awesome. Just the thing you want after walking in the sun all day long. A foot rail.
Number 7, duels at high noon. Let me paint a picture for you, partner. It's a warm summer night, and you find yourself sitting at a card table in a saloon that's named after a barnyard animal. The piano is blasting a ragtime tune as waiters bustle about, serving drinks to unruly cowboys that fill the establishment. In front of you are 3 unsavory characters, each more than the next. As the night goes on, so do the poker chips. And when one gentleman ain't taking kindly to his losses, some insults about each other's mothers are exchanged. A powerful slap reaches the man across the poker table, matching the energy of Will Smith on an Oscar night. Too soon? I don't know.
Wow, wow, West.
Wow, West. That's when it's settled. Tomorrow at high noon, they're gonna settle this like gentlemen. A duel at noon with guns. That's how they did it. Does it get any more classic than that? I don't think so, folks. The clock strikes noon, and only one outlaw remains, and he's married to Jada Smith.
Number 6, only talking. Here we go. You ever go to a bar, you're having a nice time, you and your pals order some Caesar salads for the table, the night is now well on its way, we're feeling good. Then 10 o'clock hits and you see a band start to set up. Okay, game time decision. Do we settle up and leave before they start? Or do we give them a chance, end up feeling bad, and feel obligated to stay until the very end at 3 a.m.? It's tough. Usually the latter ends up happening. Back in the 1800s, we didn't have to worry about such an issue. Most of the time, these saloons were just for business. The odd time you would have poker, dice, a piano perhaps would be in the room with some jazzy fingers making an appearance. But when saloons first popped up in Wyoming back in 1822, most of the time it was for lawmen, miners, gamblers, just pure business. Not many blind dates happening in booth 16, you know what I mean?
Number 5, Romeo and Juliet. What's in a name that which we call a rose? Any other word would smell as sweet? It's often said that art imitates life, but sometimes life can be stranger than fiction, and oftentimes really similar. The Hatfield and McCoys were two feuding families in the time of the Old West, whose hatred of one another runs deep. The most serious issues being family members removed, Old West style, by the opposite family, and in one case, a court battle over the ownership of a barnyard pig. But perhaps the best story to come of this feud is the love affair of John C. Hatfield and Rosanna McCoy. The two lovers met and instantly fell in love with each other, their families instantly disapproving of their newfound love. Similar to William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the star-crossed lovers story ends in tragedy. After multiple attempts to rekindle their love, including a daring rescue organized by Rosanna to free John C. from her own family, their love never resparked, and John C. went on to marry her cousin. It's said that poor Rosanna died of a broken heart. He loves me not. He loves me, he loves my cousin?
Number 4, bank robberies. If you're going to parody the Wild Wild West, you need a horse, you need a hat, and you need a big sack with a $sign on it. Apparently, wasn't it like Bandit Central? Weren't there bank robberies on every dusty corner in every dusty old town? No, there actually was very little, in fact. Bank robberies didn't happen that often back then. In fact, during the Wild West era, officially declared from 1865 to 1900, there were only 8 bank robberies in total. To put that in perspective, in 2017 alone, there were around 4,000 bank robberies in the United States. So it got a lot worse after the Wild Wild West. Now we're on like wild, it's like 17 wilds at this point. The first armed robbery ever in history was done by famous outlaw, you may have heard of them, Jesse James and his brother Frank. This was in 1866. The gang of outlaws robbed the Clay County Savings Association in Liberty, Missouri. We know all these bandits, but it's like they're just robbers, they're just bad people. We shouldn't really know them or glorify them. But they do this and ride horses, so it's kind of fun.
And the number 3 spot, Good Bad Town. On your way out west, you may come to find that the unsettled lands are full of danger, bandits, crooks, perilous weather, and the occasional tummy ache. When the town of Palisade, Nevada's railroad was expanded and people began to arrive in droves, the town boomed, but so did their boredom. Palisade was rather mild compared to the rest of the expanding West, so much so that when tourists began to complain of Palisade being nothing like the dangerous towns they read about in their dime novels, the people of Palisade acted by staging fake bank robberies, gunfights, and even Native American battles between them and the army, with sometimes the Native Americans participating. Also going as far as using real cattle blood during the staged combat. The citizens of Palisade were such effective actors that a lot of tourists began to run back to the train in fear of what they were seeing. Nothing more American than capitalizing on boredom.
Number 2, Helena duels. Have you guys heard of Helena duels? They're pretty intense, and they're a bit more intense than breakdancing battles, which honestly it's pretty close, but these are like right above it. Helena duels began of course in Helena, Texas, aka the toughest town on earth. At least that's what they called it back in the late 1800s. It still is pretty close. The Helena duel began here. There's even a movie called The Duel with Woody Harrelson and Liam Hemsworth. They showed this style of combat in a pretty brutal cinematic way. Opponents' left hands were tied together with buckskin and each were given a small little blade. It had to be short enough so you couldn't reach any vital organ. That was the trick. It was a brutal detail that made this an unusual event, but just like the Romans and the Colosseum, everybody likes watching violence. Depending what era it is, people are like, yeah, we'll still show up and watch people die, sure. People would make bets during these duels. How did anybody watch these at all? I can't even scroll through Reddit at night without seeing something awful, let alone a Helena duel at like 4 p.m.
And the number 1 spot, I don't like your snoring, partner. There were a handful of dangerous criminals back in the Wild West. This includes John Wesley Hardin. Born to a reverend in 1853, his parents hoped he would grow up to be a preacher. He turned out to be one of the most deadliest outlaws to ever live. Hardin claimed many lives over the years, but most bizarre was when he shot a man for snoring. One night in 1871, while staying at a hotel, Hardin was having trouble sleeping due to the man in the next room snoring loudly. Hardin promptly shouted at the man to stop snoring. Irritated with no response, he fired several shots into the next room, claiming the man's life. After years of being an outlaw and spending a lot of time in jail, he was released for good behavior, where he then received a full pardon. With his full pardon, Hardin was then able to take and pass the bar exam, afterwards setting up a law practice in Gonzales County, Texas. If your lawyer has a longer criminal history than you, there's a good chance you're not going to beat the case.